Being accurate is not always easy. Discuss these questions, keeping in mind that this is one of the tenets of the Interpreter Code of Ethics. What affected the interpreter's accuracy? What cultural influence can you identify that may affect your interpreting? When you have lost accuracy, what are the possible outcomes for everyone involved? Shannon, what would happen if the female interpreter chose not to interpret at all?
This situation has arisen more times than I care to tell, and female doesn't come into it, we've discovered. First of all, you need to understand that if you're faced with this kind of situation with any of that language, you do not have an option. You do have to interpret it. I'm going to give you an anecdote to illustrate my point of what happened in court. I was the second interpreter. I was brought in to replace the first interpreter, a male who would not interpret swearing, and it was not nearly such a sensitive situation. The situation was that a witness to a very horrible murder by 4 accused, and he was coming off drugs, and he was swearing a blue streak that first day. He was, I suppose, what's the word, drying?
On withdrawal.
Yes, thank you. And the 4 accused were sitting at the back of the courtroom, Supreme Court. This is a very serious, nasty murder, and every time the witness to the murder they had committed, allegedly, swore, they burst out laughing. But the jury, who was having to decide on the guilt or innocence of the accused, didn't speak Spanish and didn't know that the witness was swearing, because the interpreter didn't interpret a single word of the swearing. So all the jury saw was the witness describing this hideous crime, and the accused, the people accused of this hideous crime, bursting out laughing in Supreme Court now and then. They didn't know why. Well, this interpreter, somebody in court realized what was going on. This interpreter was taken off the case. I'm telling you this so that you know that you will get found out sooner or later. And he lost the work. He lost his reputation, not just with the lawyers and the judge on that case, but with the court hiring people and the other interpreter, and word gets around, and he was extremely prejudicial to the accused. You have the right to a fair trial. That was not a fair trial. And there's one more point I want to make, which I wish I had made earlier, and that is you have to, as interpreters in Canada, remember your role in the Canadian legal context. I'm told by other interpreters that in different countries, interpreters are expected to do, their role is different. The expectations on an interpreter is different, yes, and in fact, so what you have to understand is that you are interpreters in the Canadian legal context, and that is the expectation on you. You have to put aside your culture, not just for the accused. And remember, in this case, for example, this is not the first time this kind of thing has happened. It's extremely prejudicial to the accused. And in a rape case, do you really want an attacker to go free because your work wasn't adequate? And second of all, if you're not in the least bit worried about the accused, do you really want your reputation to be tarnished as a poor interpreter? Because when I was called in to replace this first interpreter, and I know who it was, it's a small community, on the record they were saying, well, due to the poor interpreting of the last time and the inadequate interpreting and the poor interpreter, we had a bad interpreter the first time around. You don't have an option. And those are just some of the consequences that will face you if you don't do the job as you're expected to do it in Canada.
When you become an interpreter, is part of that process you're agreeing to sort of separate yourself from any of your personal beliefs?
An interpreter is, if you like, a two-way telephone. An interpreter is neutral, should not show any feeling. If they have feelings, should hide them. As part of the Canadian legal context, the expectation on the interpreter in Canada.
Let's say right at the beginning of a trial, you realized that all kinds of things were coming up that you just could not maintain your sense of culture or religion. You really felt were an affront to you as a person. Could you then say to the judge or say, I have to step down from this, is that going to affect your career in the way that you were talking about
No.
this interpreter you replaced?
I've never had that kind of situation happen to me, but I have had on occasion to step down for other reasons. And they tend, anyone who understands half of what the interpreter's role is about will respect you for that. Karen's nodding her head. If you admit in the proper way, Your Honour, the interpreter does not feel she is able to go on, my Lord, the interpreter wishes to be excused from her duties, you may or may not be asked to give a reason. They're very understanding and they respect you if you take yourself off a case because you admit that this is not, that you're not able to do a good job on this one. And the key words are do a good job. If you can't do a good job, take yourself off the case.
Interpreters, like lawyers, will probably have a range of kinds of work that you're comfortable doing. And there are particular things that for whatever reason, not necessarily cultural, perhaps just your own personal reactions to certain kinds of situations are not comfortable for you. Perhaps, for example, you don't like to do child apprehension cases. Maybe stories having to listen, not even be the interpreter, simply have to be yourself sitting through a case of listening to details of child abuse, doctors' reports and teachers' reports, and maybe that just makes your heart ache and you can't stand it. You can't be an interpreter if you hate all the situations that you will face. But there are probably going to be some, just as some lawyers say, I don't do whatever it might be. Child apprehensions, sexual assault, whatever. You have to know yourself and know what you can't do. And so if you have any forewarning of the nature of a case, whether because you're working with the lawyer in his office or for any other reason, do yourself and everyone a favor. Say, no, I'm not going to take that job. You can simply say, my lord, a conflict of interest, write it down, learn it, memorize it. A conflict of interest has arisen for the interpreter. And you don't have to explain what your conflict of interest is. It very well might be that you've seen the list of witnesses and you know one of the witnesses. It might be that you have come to know that you have a family connection or a social connection with the accused. It could be anything. And it could be that you are feeling horribly uncomfortable. Whatever the source of your conflict of interest, the point is the same, the one that Shannon made. You can't do a good job here. But it's not even the court's business as to what is the source of your conflict of interest. As soon as possible, you simply advise the court a conflict of interest has risen for the interpreter, and she would ask to be excused, please. Do not, if you don't have a migraine, plead illness. That doesn't gain you any brownie points. Just be frank and upfront. I have a conflict of interest here and I am unable to continue. Obviously, as I say, you can't do it with every sort of case or you won't be taken seriously as a professional. But for those few times, like this one, for the interpreter that we saw, where you just can't do it, that's your out. Those three little words, conflict of interest.
Well, I would say that it is not the responsibility of the interpreter to make sure that the person understands. It's the responsibility of the lawyer. And by changing the terminology, the interpreter is giving a different perception of the lawyer to the client than the client would have if he'd heard exactly the words that the lawyer had used. Now, I do know that it is a problem. You may be completely aware of the fact that everything that's being said is just going way above the understanding of the person for whom you are interpreting. There are some ways that you may handle that depending on the situation. In an interview situation, of course, the interpreter should let the lawyer know and then wait for the lawyer to lower the language register. In the court, it's slightly different. In the court, the interpreter really cannot do anything but interpret exactly what he hears. And if the client doesn't understand, or if the accused doesn't understand, well, you know, many English speakers do not understand what is going on in court. And it's then the responsibility of that person to let the lawyer know through you that they don't understand what you are saying. You are taking a grave responsibility on your shoulders if you try to make sure that a person understands. That's not really your job.